Welcome, welcome. Hello, everyone. Welcome to St. James Lutheran Church for this wonderful, wonderful event for Mental Health and Faith Community Forum featuring the Reverend Dr. Cody J. Sanders, who comes to us from Luther Seminary in St. Paul, Minnesota. My name is Pastor Amy, and I have the pleasure of serving the people of St. James Lutheran Church here in Lake Forest. We are delighted to have you all here joining in person or online tonight. I'll give you a few housekeeping notes before I introduce you to our speaker. First of all, this is a public seminar and it's being recorded, and everyone who registered will receive a follow-up email with a link to tonight's recording. For those in person tonight, there are restrooms right down the hall. When you exit the sanctuary, the doors and turn to the right for the restrooms. We will have a time of Q&A after Dr. Cody's presentation. In person, please step up to the microphone, which I will place in the middle here when it is time, and I'll signal you for that. For those online, feel free to drop a question in the chat. We are doing this hybrid thing, and it's so interesting and exciting, so thank you. All are welcome to stay for a dessert reception after the presentation. We'll have Dr. Cody's latest book for sale in the gathering area, and you can learn more about Luther Seminary there as well. Before we begin, a bunch of thank yous are in order. Can you all hear me? Is it too loud? No, we're good? Okay. Thank you to Elizabeth Shane-Knecht, Senior Philanthropic Advisor for Luther Seminary. It was actually through Elizabeth and her ability to make and maintain connections with people that this all came together. So thank you so much. And thank you to our members, Ron and Marilyn Kepke, who connected with Elizabeth in the first place and volunteered to distribute flyers all over the place, opened their home, and supported every piece of this event. Thank you to our staff at the church, especially our Director of Operations and Communications, who is behind the camera right now, making sure everything's put together, Stacy Eppel, who poured herself into this event and bringing it to life. It's fantastic. Thank you to our facilities manager, Pete Clemens, for managing our sound and keeping the church looking spiffy at all times. So appreciate it. Thank you to our office coordinator, Joan Krickow, for helping with registration and being an all-around support. And thank you to all the wonderful volunteers who brought desserts and provided hospitality for this evening. And thank you to all of you who have taken the time to come here or watch online to continue learning how we can come together as people of faith to support each other in holistic ways. It's wonderful seeing the Village of Care come together like this, and to know that none of us is alone in this tumultuous time. Tonight's event is generously sponsored by the Stephen Lumen Mental Illness Education Fund and the Tony Danielson Fund. So thank you so very much for all those that are involved in that. I have the honor and privilege of introducing you all to Reverend Dr. Cody J. Sanders, Cody, tonight for this vital topic, the age of loneliness and the role of hope in mental health. Cody is an ordained Baptist minister, professor, and author who teaches in the areas of pastoral theology and spiritual care within congregational and community contexts. Cody is a leader in the area of LGBTQIA+ spiritual care, writing and speaking frequently on the subject in churches and academic institutions. You can read more about him in your program as well, but he is a practitioner of narrative theories of pastoral care and counseling, training clergy, students, and lay leaders in these skills of caregiving. His current research aims to help leaders build capacity in order to cultivate caring communities amid the complexities of our world. And goodness, do we need that right now. I could not think of a better person to lead us in this discussion. Thank you so very much to Dr. Cody for being willing to travel to Lake Forest for this opportunity. And please join me in welcoming Reverend Dr. Cody J. Sanders.
Thank you. Thank you, and thank you all for being here. And thank you to St. James for this Really wonderful hospitality I've experienced this evening. It's good to be with you. I teach what we call at Luther congregational care. And to me, that means not just teaching pastors how to care well for their congregations. That also means teaching pastors how to help their congregations care well for each other. And going out into congregations all around the country to help congregations become communities of care for their congregants and for the wider communities that they serve. What I want to do in this talk is something a little beyond what the book covers. The book Spiritual Care First Aid just came out this year from Fortress Press. And what the book does is gives you a really helpful crash course in all of the caregiving skills that one needs to be a compassionate companion to people on various kinds of journeys in their life. How to be a really good listener, which is not something we're trained to do in our society at this point. How to ask questions that help more of a person's story to be told. How to develop your own less anxious presence with other people. What to do when mental health concerns arise and it's time to make an introduction to another kind of professional, what we often call referral. What to do when things like suicidality arise or abuse and violence. So it's a very practical book that I wrote because for the last 10 years or so before I came to Luther, I was serving in congregations and training lay people in the practices of pastoral care, because no congregation should expect the pastor to be the only one that practices care in that congregation. Even for a small congregation, it's too much for one person to do. So I was training lay people to do that work in congregations, but I could never find the resource I wanted to use for that kind of training. So I was designing my own training for that decade, and then decided, well, it would be probably helpful for other pastors if they just had this training in a book. And so that's how Spiritual Care First Aid came about. Tonight, I want to take a sort of broader view of mental health, spiritual health, well-being, to help you maybe expand a little bit your conception of what we mean when we talk about health or flourishing or well-being, and what it might mean to practice care in a community. So I want to start with how I think about the person, the human being. And this sounds really complicated, bio-psycho-spiritual, eco-techno-social approach to being human. But you know what every one of these words means. That we are biological beings. We have bodies, we are bodies, we move about the world in bodies, and care for bodies matters. A lot of what we have done over the course of time with both spiritual care and psychological care has divorced our sense of spiritual health and mental health from the fact that we are embodied, and we need to care for bodies. The psycho, I think, is the one that you know very well, the ways in which we experience a wide range of mental health and well-being throughout our lives. We often focus most on mental illness, but what I want to focus on tonight is mental health and the ways that we are always moving along this continuum of health, of difficulty, of struggle, of well-being, of flourishing. And no matter if you've ever had a diagnosis, you have mental health. And sometimes you likely have mental struggle and periods of time when you aren't well, even if that never rises to a clinical degree. The spiritual, we're sitting in the sanctuary of a church that has cared for the souls of generations of people. And even psychologists and psychotherapists now are more and more integrating spiritual care into psychotherapeutic practice, something that pastoral counselors and psychotherapists have been doing for, 80, 90 years. The ecological is the one that churches have tended to not be very good at, understanding how our human lives are inextricably bound up within the wider web of ecological life, and that the life of our wider world, the ecological world, is actually quite tightly bound up with our own health and well-being. We see that more as we're experiencing climate collapse and places in the world that are becoming unlivable, uninhabitable, because of the warming of the planet, the acidification of oceans, etc. And we have, whether we attend to them or not, relationships with the wider web of life. So I want to talk a little bit about how that factors into our mental spiritual health. At this point in our history, if we're thinking about what it means to be human and we aren't thinking about our lives as bound up with the technological, then we're missing an entirely, a huge component of what it means to be human today. We are shaped in ways that we don't even recognize by our engagement with technology, and technology's engagement in our lives in ways that we sometimes don't even see. The way that algorithmic life cultivates these little spheres in which we live, and the sphere in which I live on my phone may be entirely different from the sphere that my neighbor lives in technologically, because the algorithm feeds us what we want, and more of what it realizes we want. The technological is shaping us even more profoundly now as we're getting into the increased acceleration of artificial intelligence. So if we're not taking into account the technological, the ways our lives are entirely bound up with the technosphere, then we're missing a big piece of what it means to be human right now, what it means to care for communities. And then the social. The social is just simply about our life bound up within the larger social sphere of communities. So a little definition: we are inspirited body minds alive within a technospheric network of socio-cultural political communities, inextricably bound within the wider web of life on Earth through dimensions of space and time and kinship. And all of these things is what it means to be human for us right now. And in a good practice of care, we're attentive to all of these ways in which our well-being, our flourishing, and the harm that has caused us is taking shape. So I want to talk a little bit, though, about a particular form of biopsychosocial, eco-techno, spiritual well-being that's bound up within the age of loneliness. And loneliness and isolation and solitude are really three different experiences. So I want to tease out a little bit about what these mean when we talk about these things. Loneliness is the subjective experience of missing some feeling of closeness. It could be not having the number of connections we want to with other people. It could be not having the quality of connections we want to have with other people. But loneliness is entirely subjective. You can feel lonely in a crowd. You can feel lonely, yet have a whole lot of friendships, connections with others. Isolation moves into the objective state of being alone, being cut off from others, not having the other people in our lives that we need. And it's a risk factor for loneliness, but it's not the same thing as loneliness. We can think about isolation in sort of our day-to-day lives when an elder in our congregation has to leave their home and move into a nursing home, and it's too far away for them to come to church anymore on a regular basis. This happened in my congregation in Cambridge from time to time when someone would need to go into a nursing home, and nursing homes were more affordable an hour outside of the city than they were in the city. And that kind of isolation from the community that you've grown deep roots within is the objective experience of being cut off from human community. You can experience isolation, though, and not experience loneliness. Nelson Mandela talked about being in prison and how during periods of isolation, literal physical isolation, that he never felt lonely because he felt connected to all the other people who were with him in that place. So loneliness and isolation are related but different. Solitude, however, is the chosen experience of needing to be alone, to recharge, to care for ourselves. Contemplation is healthy, it's necessary for reflection and restoration. And we all have different levels of need for solitude. I get recharged by being alone, and others find being alone really difficult. So it's also a very subjective experience. But the loneliness and isolation are the experiences I want to land on a little bit more this evening. I want to talk a bit about this framework that you'll just see show up throughout the talk tonight. These three frameworks for thinking about our ways of belonging. The transcendence dimension describes our belongingness to God, the ways that we feel connected to a sense of something or someone, a being beyond us. The togetherness dimension is about our belonging to one another, to others in human community, the ways that we locate ourselves within the communities of belonging. And the tethering dimension, again, one that we don't often give a lot of attention to in much of the Christian tradition, is about our belonging to the web of life, the ways that we belong to an ecological setting, the ways that we belong to a landscape. I've often started asking people, in small groups, new students or whatever, instead of going around and saying what degree program you're in and where you're from and things like that, I ask them to tell a story about a landscape that they feel they belong to. And the stories they tell are really incredible. One new student at Luther a year ago talked about, he had never thought of this before, but he talked about his entire life and ministry and how it was related to this one particular river in his state, and how he heard his sense of call to ministry at this particular place along that river. Later on, moved to another place, still on that river, to serve a church. Later on, got married and moved to another place on that river with his spouse, and how that river was a part of his ecological belonging. It's, in many ways, like a family member. The trees that you see every day, the birds and squirrels in your backyard that join you when you're eating on your back porch. These are the ecological members of our web of life. And we have not often been invited to think about those ecological beings as community. But I think we do ourselves a disservice, mentally, spiritually, biologically, if we are not cultivating a relationship with that wider web of life. And how I see the self, who we are as human beings, is somewhere bound up in that intersection between our belonging to human community, our belonging to God, and our belonging to the web of life. And what health does is really attend to how this connection is being cultivated and maintained. So I want to talk about that connection to all three of these communities in some, maybe, hopefully, some more complex ways than you have been led to think of them before. But I want to start with this piece that you probably have thought about. I imagine many of you read about 2 years ago or so when the Surgeon General's advisory on our epidemic of loneliness and isolation came out. If you haven't read it, it's about 80 pages. Really, really terrific research. It's sort of a meta-analysis of many studies of loneliness and isolation over the course of time. Oh, thank you. And in that study, he found that about 1 in 2 adults in the U.S. report experiencing loneliness. About half of us report not having either the number or the quality of human relationships that we desire, that we need. What was even more surprising in that study was the way in which loneliness and isolation contributed to harm on multiple levels, not just our mental health. I think we can all imagine the ways loneliness and isolation affects our mental health. But what this analysis showed is that loneliness is associated with a greater risk of cardiovascular disease, dementia, stroke, and depression and anxiety, and premature death. It caused about the same degree of harm to our bodies as smoking 15 cigarettes a day. That's an astounding finding. I'll talk a little bit more in a minute about why that is. But first, I want you to note this line that I think was the most haunting line in that 80-page study. Murthy said, "We will continue to splinter and divide until we can no longer stand as a community or a country." That loneliness and isolation as an epidemic contributes to the splintering of our society. Get more into that in a moment, too. I'm going to loosen my collar. So this is the piece around why loneliness harms that I think is really interesting to land on for a minute. It doesn't really make sense that loneliness and isolation would be as harmful to us as smoking 15 cigarettes a day. That is a weird finding. But this is the reason it is so harmful to our bodies, not just our mental health. And of course, our mental health is entirely bound up with our bodies. Our brains aren't floating around outside of us. They're a part of us. And sensations of loneliness evolved over the course of human development as a warning signal to us. Loneliness said to us in an earlier iteration of human life, when if you were cut off from your community, you were at risk of literally dying, either because you wouldn't be able to feed yourself apart from the community, or you might be in danger of attack by a wild animal wherever your community lived. So when you were cut off from your human community, the signal of loneliness in our brain said, you're in danger. You need to get connected to people, because it was a matter of literal survival. Well, over the course of time, that has not been true anymore. Any of us could probably go off for a week or two and survive on our own in some way or another, but our brains still have that signal of loneliness that not only says, wouldn't it be nice to talk to a friend, but our brains still hear that message as you're in danger. And when our brain has that danger signal, and this is the very old reptilian part of our brain, when our brain has that signal, it stresses the body to feel like you're in danger. So if half of the US, adults at least, are experiencing loneliness and isolation on a regular basis, this signal of danger is what is creating that health concern that increases our propensity for heart disease, pulmonary diseases, dementia, stroke, etc. And when that happens, this ability to self-regulate emotions decreases, even at the cellular level, leaving us vulnerable to stressors, less able to soothe and heal. It also means we may start seeing social dangers everywhere, even when there aren't social dangers everywhere. Because our brain is saying to our body, you're in danger, you're in danger. And then we start seeing danger where there is no danger. And this sort of distorted social cognition harms our abilities to see others' perspectives, to empathize with other people, and it even makes us less satisfied with the connections and relationships that we do have. It causes us to be more distrustful of others. So this is the harm of loneliness. So you see how this is bound up with this notion of mental health. And I think for churches in particular, looking at the gifts that we have in knowing how to cultivate community in the midst of a national epidemic of loneliness and isolation means that we have some genuine gifts to bring to our community in ways that I don't think we always recognize. I remember teaching a student in a class a couple of years ago, and we were talking about cultivating community. And it struck me that this student said, this was an online post, the student wrote something like, she was really excited about the potential for churches cultivating communities. And she said, but I know churches aren't supposed to be community centers, but this seems really important. And I thought, where did you get the idea that churches weren't supposed to be community centers? They are centers of community with Christ at the center, but Christ never called solo disciples. Christ called people into community, constantly inviting people into human community. If you read the healing narratives of the Gospels, you'll also notice that usually there's another movement of healing beyond the physical healing that takes place. There's usually the admonition that Jesus gives to the person who's healed to go return to your community. Even the really profound story of the Gerasene demoniac, when his community had put him into the tombs and tied him up presumably to keep him safe. It wasn't because they were, punishing him, but he would harm himself, so they chained him up in the tombs. When he was healed, do you remember what he said? He wanted to go with Jesus. And Jesus said, no, return to your community and tell them what has happened to you. So returning people to community is usually that sort of second movement in even many of the healing stories in the Gospels. So we had a great discussion in that class about how churches are certainly community centers, and one of the gifts we bring to our communities is this embedded knowledge in our congregations of how to bring people together, and often how to bring people together who are really different from one another in many ways. But over the course of this sort of loneliness epidemic that we're seeing, I want you to notice the ways that our pulling apart from other people, our pulling apart from the wider web of life is sort of stressing and straining this locus that I'm identifying as our sense of self or soul at the middle of this belonging to God, belonging to others, belonging to the earth. I want to tell you this story. I've been interviewing pastors lately about ways that their conceptions of the future, the near future, next 10 years or so, are impacting their ministries right now. And I had this really wonderful conversation with a pastor of a very rural church in a farming community in the upper Midwest. And she told me a couple of stories that I thought were just exemplary stories of a pastor attending to the life of her community. First story she told me was that in her town, there's only one nursing home. So when she goes to visit the parishioners in the nursing home, she goes to this one nursing home in town, visits her 6 or 7 parishioners who are there, and then she visits anyone else in that nursing home who wants to have a visit. Because it is a place where a lot of people are lonely. Now, I imagine a lot of pastors do that. But what was so interesting to me about this pastor was that she was doing this in tension with her congregation. And maybe you can help me make sense of this, because I have not been able to make sense of it yet. Her congregation hates the fact that she visits everyone else in the nursing home, just wants her to visit their parishioners. So much so that they even drive by the church to see if her car's in the parking lot, and then they'll drive by the nursing home and see that she's at the nursing home and ask her why she isn't in her office. And I'm thinking, wow, this pastor is doing the ministry of this congregation, and they're fighting her over building community among people in their town who are truly isolated, not only lonely, but isolated oftentimes. The other thing that she does that I thought was really beautiful is that once a month, she and another pastor in town will buy dozens and dozens of donuts. They'll drive, I think she said, 40 minutes to the high school that serves the few little towns around that area. They'll put tables out in front of the high school, and these 2 pastors will just hand out donuts to kids as they're going into school. Meet them, introduce themselves. No programming, not trying to get them to come to any kind of youth group, nothing like that. Just giving out donuts at the church. At the school, at the high school. And she said the reason she does this is that if there's ever a tragedy in that town, whether it's a school shooting or a teenager who dies in a car accident, she doesn't want those kids to be meeting her for the first time when she shows up at a tragedy. She wants to have relationships with them. Her church also fights her at every turn on that ministry too, not understanding how that is ministry. But I tell these stories of hers because I think they're exemplary of a church in a really rural setting that's truly building some community in some really unique ways. And she's bringing people along with her in this ministry. A couple other things she does, just to mention. Farmers in the area, for some reason the farmers don't belong to her church. And the people in her church sort of have negative views about the farmers around their area. But what she does once a year is that, and she's bringing her church along in this. This has been a process for her. Once a year, they make, however many meals for all of the farm workers in their surrounding area, and they take them out to the farms, and they just give these farmers and their crews an appreciative lunch to say thank you for feeding their community. And once a year, in this little town served by this little volunteer fire department, once a year the church has a spaghetti supper, brings, bunches of people from the town into the church, feeds the firefighters, has a little fundraiser because they need the funding in that fire department. So I tell these stories because this is a good example of a pastor seeing the needs in that community and helping her church to come along with her in bringing people together amid the epidemic of loneliness and isolation in a place where that kind of fragmentation is really harmful, not only for individuals, but for the community. I'll tell some other stories a little bit later like that, but I wanted to be sure you heard some of her stories. The next piece of this that I want to land on for a minute is the more socio-political dimension of loneliness and isolation. Hannah Arendt, philosopher of totalitarianism who studied the aftermath of World War II, she studied how the Nazi regime came to power in Germany. And in that really robust study that she did, one of the features that she identified is what she called organized loneliness. She said what prepared people for totalitarianism in a place that was not totalitarian at the time was the fact that loneliness became an everyday experience for more and more people. Whereas at one time it was an experience that was only on the margins of the community, but it had become an everyday experience for people. And it allowed totalitarianism to get a foothold in the country. I think this, when I read that quote from Vivek Murthy in the Surgeon General's report, where he said, "We will continue to splinter and divide as a country until we can no longer stand," I immediately thought of Hannah Arendt, because this is what she found in studying the aftermath of Nazi Germany. I want to share with you this research from Mark Dunkelman at Brown. It's a really good book called The Vanishing Neighbor if you're interested in getting deeper into this. But Dunkelman has this nice way of thinking about the ways that we have sort of three nested layers of community in our lives typically. This inner layer he calls the family and close friends, the blood and intimacy connection. These are people that we are, our family members, our closest friends, the people that we are intimately related to. This outer layer he calls the tribe. These are people we share affinities with. This could be political affiliations, religious ideologies or communities, national identities. These are not people we necessarily know in our everyday life, but we're connected to them because we share the same political party, or we're, Lutherans, and we're this kind of Lutheran and not that kind of Lutheran. It gets really deep into this kind of tribe. Shared affinities. The inner circle, the sort of middle circle there, he called the familiar but not intimate, the village. These are the people that we see on a regular basis in third spaces and coffee shops and restaurants, at the grocery store. They're people who live near us. They're our neighbors, but they're not our close, intimate friends. But they're part of our regular village. Around the 1980s, Dunkelman found statistically that people started to spend more time at home than in public. They started to spend more time around the television at home. And then let me tell you this part first. He says that in the inner circle, we learn love from our close, intimate relationships. In the outer circle, we learn loyalty to those that we share affinities with. And in the middle circle, middle ring, we learn tolerance. Because most of those people are different from us in some ways, and we have to learn to get along, to exist with them in the village. But what he found was that in the 80s, people spending more time at home, and then that was sort of exacerbated around 2010 when smartphone technology came out and we were spending more and more time on social media, that actually increased connections in this inner ring, because like how many of you stay in regular contact with your children or grandchildren who live far away from you via technology? So yeah, I mean, half at least, more than half probably. I can talk with my sister about what I had for dinner tonight, but we live 1,000 miles away from each other. So it strengthened these bonds in some ways. And of course, if we're spending more time at home, we're strengthening the bonds with the people we live with. It also strengthened the affinity, tribe, loyalty bonds, because now we're connected with people all over the world who share some affinity with us, whether that's our political party, our religious group, our interest in knitting, whatever it might be. It strengthened those bonds because we can be connected with them on a regular basis. But the middle ring started to fade away. And the middle ring is the key to social cohesion, because that's where we learn tolerance. That's where we learn how to be with other people who are not like us in some way or another. And that ring started to fade. He even sent his graduate students out into really, densely populated parks and things in New York City to make observations of what people were doing there. And there would be hundreds of people around in a park, but they observed most of the people were on their phones. They were probably connecting with other people, but they were connecting with other people in their intimacy circle or their affinity circle. They weren't learning tolerance by connecting with people who are right around them in their village. This is the kind of contemporary iteration, I think, of what Hannah Arendt described as organized loneliness. And we know that technology has a very intentional way of hooking our attention. that attention is now the economy that technology deals with. And it gets us further and further into connections in these outer and inner layers with this eroding middle circle. And the result is something like this, moving again away, stressing and straining this inner area of our sense of self and our connection to others and to the web of life. I want to tell this story because it's one that I find that we need right now in our setting and situation. The MCC Church of San Francisco was the Metropolitan Community Church. This was a church founded in 1968 as a place of belonging for LGBTQ people when no other denominations were embracing LGBTQ people. Interestingly, the founder, Troy Perry, when he founded this, he invited people to come to his living room for a Bible study, and 12 people showed up in 1968. And his intention was that this would just sort of be a temporary stopgap measure. They would do this for a couple of years until all of the mainline denominations came around and embraced LGBTQ people in 1968. That, in case you weren't following, that didn't happen. And the MCC Church grew into a really robust denomination. In fact, it was the largest grassroots movement of LGBTQ people in history. The first building ever owned by an LGBTQ organization was the sanctuary that the MCC Church built in 1970 in Los Angeles. And of course, they founded a congregation in San Francisco, and it was in the Castro district, probably the gayest square mile in the world. A lot of the folks in the MCC of San Francisco in the 80s and 90s were, of course, men who were dying of AIDS. My friend Jim Matulski is here in the middle. he was called to the church as the pastor at the very early days of the AIDS epidemic. And he served that congregation for 10 years. And he was a seminarian when he showed up there and was called as their pastor. This church was growing exponentially and dying so quickly. He estimates that he probably did about 1,000 funerals in that 10 years. They were having 3 or 4 funerals a week. Men were coming to the congregation with their IV poles, some of them too sick to even sit up during the service. They would have to lay in the pews. At some point in time in the service, all of their watches would start going off because it was time for them to take their AZT. And Jim describes this period in the life of that church where, they were taking care of each other as they were dying. And it took about 36 pills a day, and that was the best treatment that they had for AIDS at the time. 36 pills a day. They weren't very effective. They made the men really, really, really sick. And the only thing that really helped to sort of keep the nausea down was marijuana. And so the city government just sort of looked the other way and let buyers clubs sort of emerge so that men who were dying of AIDS could buy marijuana and not be prosecuted, things like that. But there was a period when a really ambitious attorney general in California, who had aspirations to be the governor, cracked down on all of the buyers clubs and shut them down overnight. So men could no longer access marijuana in order to get through their AIDS treatment in the last days of their lives. And a woman in the church who had lost her son and her son's partner to AIDS was talking to Jim about this problem. And Jim was saying, do you think we as a church could get men the marijuana that they need? And this woman said, yeah, absolutely we can. And I'll stand right beside you as we pass it out to them. So every Sunday for, not exactly sure how long this lasted, after communion and before the closing hymn, men could come forward in the church. This was part of the liturgical life of the church. Could come forward in the sanctuary and get a little baggie of marijuana to take home with them. And Jim said they had rules. You had to have a doctor's note. There could be no money exchanged. You just came, you received the marijuana, and you went and got through another week with it. Eventually, the city government still let this happen, but the federal government eventually cracked down on this and shut it down. But this is a story that I think that churches need right now, because it's a story of a community trying to keep each other alive in an era when the government literally wanted them dead. And they did this at great peril to themselves, individually and as a congregation. And I remember what Jim said about this. He said, I didn't know what I could do, but this was something that I could do. And it was a risk, and I took it because I loved these people in this church. And he said, you will never regret a risk of great love. And if you don't get anything else tonight, I want you to go home with this podcast. It has just come out. It's on the 5th episode right now. It's called When We All Get to Heaven. It's made by a historian named Lynn Gerber, who's sort of become the historian of this church during this era. You can find it with this QR code if you just open your phone app, your photo app, and point it at this QR code, or you can write down this URL here. This is the story of a church that was really taking some pretty extreme acts of care and compassion for their community in a time when they were literally dying. So I do really hope that you will go home with this podcast and start listening to it. So the stories that churches need right now in order to thrive in an era that feels like many of us are sort of getting pushed to the edges of our communities and are in great peril. And it will require great risk on behalf of churches to stand with people in these in these positions. From organized loneliness, I want to talk a little bit about organized abandonment. And I think the story that you just heard about the MCC Church of San Francisco is a pretty clear example of organized abandonment. The ways in which the government, quite literally were taking away support structures from people that needed those structures and those ways of staying alive. Ruth Wilson Gilmore is an abolitionist geographer. She describes organized abandonment as the dismantling of and divestment from private capitalist structures and public structures that communities depend on, like schools, public healthcare systems, safe infrastructure, in favor of heavy investment in law enforcement, which is then deployed as the lone remedy for all problems that arise from the deficits that divestment creates. I think a year ago, if I were talking with you about organized abandonment, I would really need to spend a lot of time unpacking what this means, especially in a community that might not experience this organized abandonment quite as much as some other communities. When I gave this presentation to a church in South Dakota 6-7 months ago, the clearest example they had in their minds of organized abandonment was the way in which it had become impossible to have a baby in that community. Because the first thing to go in a small hospital is labor and delivery and maternity care. So now everyone in that community who has a baby has to drive to the next biggest city to have a baby. And we have all been seeing, I hope you're paying attention to the ways that rural health care is continuing to be sort of intentionally collapsed. So this is an example of organized abandonment that would really hit home for that community. I think today, all I really would have to do is just show you some headlines. I'll just put these up and let you read them very briefly so you get an example of what organized abandonment looks like right now. The story I found most inspiring in the last year or so that directly addresses organized abandonment is the story of the very first program that was developed by the Black Panthers. When the Panthers started, the earliest iteration of their mutual care for a community was the Free Breakfast for Children program. And this program developed when the Panthers joined with a pastor, Reverend Earl Neal of St. Augustine's Episcopal Church in Oakland, California. And I told this story once to a group of Episcopalians in St. Paul, and there were 3 or 4 senior adult black women who had belonged to a historic black Episcopal church in St. Paul. And afterwards, they all said, Reverend Neal was our pastor before he went to Oakland. So he's this St. Paul connection too, which I love. So the Panthers, Reverend Earl Neal at St. Augustine's, a few parishioners, and a bunch of neighborhood mothers got together, and they started feeding children in their community because children were going to school hungry, unable to learn. Soon, within about a year, they were feeding 20,000 children in programs all over the state. And this was entirely mutual aid that the Panthers organized. Then, J. Edgar Hoover named the Panthers the greatest threat to the internal security of the country because of this program. Because they were bringing people together against the forces of organized abandonment that intended to make some people disposable. The FBI started an intentional process of collapsing the Free Breakfast for Children program. They sent letters to stores that were donating the food to discourage them from donating it. They spread rumors in the community that the food was poisoned so that children wouldn't come to the free breakfast programs. And FBI agents even raided free breakfast programs while the children were eating. And this was because people came together against the forces of organized abandonment to care for one another. And the great threat to the internal security of the country was a bunch of neighborhood mothers and some church folks and some of the Panthers who were coming together to feed children. This is a story the church needs right now, because increasingly we are seeing acts of care and compassion criminalized. Chicago right now is the epicenter of clergy being attacked in demonstrations to stand in solidarity with immigrants in your community. So you know this very well. Compassion is being criminalized. And even some within our own, Christian family, our own siblings in faith, have started to call empathy a sin. So if you are in a church like this one and the other places that you come from, I hope you are seeing your acts of compassion, your acts of bringing people together in community, your acts of mutual aid to care for people who are falling through the cracks amid organized abandonment, as true radical acts of ministry in the way of Jesus. And I hope that if you live in a state like Minnesota, where every child goes to school and eats for free every single day, you know you owe it to the Black Panthers for that, because the state could not win that fight against them. So what they did instead was the government subsumed the Free Breakfast for Children program by increasing funding for free breakfasts. So when you can't beat them, you just sort of take over the program, which is exactly what happened. So from organized abandonment, I want to go to one more piece here, which is the age of loneliness in the ecological sense, what biologist E.O. Wilson called the Eremocene. And what he meant by this is that humans are becoming a lone species on a planet that was once rich and lush with life, that we are losing species at an increasingly alarming rate. He says roughly 1 million species of plants and animals face extinction within a decade, or within decades, as a result of human actions. We don't typically think of this as a loneliness problem, but if we are thinking about our relationship with the wider web of life, then that's what makes climate collapse, the extinction of species, the unlivability of life for other beings on the planet, an issue of community, of loneliness. And I think we are reaping the perils of our inability to see ourselves as bound up in relationship with the wider web of life right now. That we have only seen the wider web of life as either resources for human consumption or as something to appreciate, but not something to be in relationship with, or not a collective of beings to be in relationship with. And another philosopher of the environment, Glenn Albright, calls this notion solastalgia, gives us this term solastalgia to describe the pain and distress, of seeing our larger ecological web of life collapse, and lacking solace in a place that used to feel like home to us, even though we have not left that place. It's the place that is changing by the actions of humanity in destroying the ecological web. So in many of the other ways that we've seen, the epidemic of loneliness and isolation, organized abandonment, etc., the age of loneliness, the Eremocene, is also stressing and straining our relationship with this kind of tripartite collective of beings, God, others, and the web of life. We can't do this one right now, but I want to give you this QR code too. This is a multi-species relationality exercise that I developed during the pandemic with my congregation in Cambridge. When so many of us were longing for connection and community, and the connection with our human community was not really possible because of the need to protect one another from the virus. So I developed this exercise to help people lean more into the relationality with the larger web of life. And the stories my congregants started telling me over Zoom in the months after that were really remarkable. The trees that they had passed by every day for decades and have never really even thought about, that they were now developing a sense of relationality to. That they were stopping to spend time with trees that they had only ever thought of as sort of part of the, mise-en-scènes of their life. So I give you that to take home with you. There's also an iteration of this in the book, the Spiritual Care First Aid book. So what I'm hoping for out of this time with you is that you're starting to see in some of these stories and in some of these conceptual frameworks the ways that you and your community are fitting into this picture, the ways that you're creating potentials for healing and wholeness that are bringing back together the togetherness dimension, transcendence dimension, and tethering dimension, because these are the dimensions of belonging in our lives that contribute to that health and sense of flourishing within the bio, psycho, spiritual, eco, techno, social aspects of our life. I want to be sure to leave a good bit of time for questions and discussion, but let me give you these just brief. I'm not going to read all of these, but if you want to take a photo of them, feel free to. I asked a group of clergy what they were doing in their congregations that were sort of micro experiments in cultivation of community, just small things that they did that made a really big impact on the life of their church or their community. Here are the 10 that they told me about. Of course, gathering around meals in more intentional ways, a men's coffee group, middle school breakfasts, drawing names to go out with one another for a meal. If you were taking a picture, you might not have had time. Did you get all these? Anyone stand out of the way? Dinners where people invite each other over in the church in an organized way, renovating space in the sanctuary so that people can gather before and after worship, sounding the call. When someone feels like, this was the church that actually, where I was ordained in Atlanta, when someone felt a call to do some kind of ministry, rather than trying to work through the committees to figure out if they could do it or not, et cetera, the person would go into, to the front of the sanctuary during the invitation in good Baptist fashion on Sunday morning, and they would sound the call and say, I have this sense of call to start a ministry that does X, Y, or Z thing. Anyone else who feels a call to that kind of ministry, come and join me at the front of the sanctuary. And if 5 or 6 people came and joined them, then they started that ministry. If no one came to join them, then that ministry probably wasn't going to get off the ground. But it was a really great way to let sort of small ministries flourish in this parish. Wednesday dinners. This one was a really touching one from a pastor who had struggled with his own addiction. And when he told that story to the congregation that he went to later, it sort of reduced the stigma enough for people to come together and engage one another and feel more understood by one another. And of course, shared work or mission, service. when I asked this question to clergy, they could all think of one simple thing that made a really big impact on their life and in their community. Another place I would encourage you to get inspiration for this kind of ministry of connection, of community, is the podcast House Calls, which was Vivek Murthy's podcast when he was the Surgeon General. You can still find all the old episodes of those online. Every one of those is a story of somebody who was cultivating community in a way that made a difference for their neighbors. I think every clergy person should listen to that. I think any congregant who's interested in this kind of work would find inspiration from that. And here are just 6 books that I think you could go from this to explore more about belonging and community. These 2 dealing more with the ecological sense of belonging. These 2 addressing, these 3 actually, including that one, just more human community belonging. And Let This Radicalize You is one of the best books that I've read recently that I think addresses our current context of organized abandonment and the criminalization of care in ways that are really practical for churches to engage that scene. And I'll have this outside afterwards. I'm glad to talk with you more about it. I also just noticed my editor at Fortress Press came in during the talk, so glad to have you here, Yvonne, who helped see this book into life. I'll put this up there with my email address here. If you want to get in touch with me, feel free to do that. I'd be glad to follow up with you about any resources you might want to think more about after this. And now we have a good bit of time, maybe 25 minutes or so for Q&A.
That sounds great. Now it's working. Oh, there we go. All right, I'm going to put this here. Does that work okay? Yeah. If anyone has any questions, they're welcome to come to the microphone, or I can pass them a microphone, whatever they're most comfortable with.
So in your 10 experiments that you showed up there, I was amazed at the number of them that involve food.
Yeah.
Why? Explain. What's your thoughts about food and community and food and togetherness?
Yeah, I mean, I think that is just a deeply human thing. Going back to our evolutionary roots of surviving together around food, feeding each other in community. I think of how many parables involve food. How many times Jesus is moving through places and inviting people to the table with him. The only miracle story, I'm fairly certain, correct me, pastors, if I'm wrong, the only miracle story in all 4 Gospels is the feeding of the 5,000. The one story important enough for all 4 Gospel writers to name was the one where Jesus fed people. So yeah, I think there's something just very deep both in our human experience and in our faith tradition that puts food in the center of community. And interestingly, I mean, we have food in the center of our worship services every Sunday in many churches too. And the feeding of the 5,000 text, if you read it really carefully, is a Eucharistic text. When Matthew tells that story, he uses this very clear Eucharistic formula. He took, blessed, broke, gave, and everyone ate it. That's the Eucharistic formula in the Gospels, and it's right there in that text of the feeding of the 5,000. But we've rarely ever seen that as a Eucharistic text. So yeah, all those things. Another story that I hope that you'll access if you listen to the Vivek Murthy's House Calls podcast. I can't remember the name of this podcast, but it was a woman who started a meal in her backyard for her neighbors. She just put out a big table, would fix a meal, invite everyone on the block to come, and it just grew and grew and grew, and people would come with food, and they would feed each other. And it became such an important place of community that some of her neighbors started to ask her if they could have their weddings in her backyard. because it was the one place where they all felt like they belonged. Yeah, I don't know, food is magic in that way. I think it nourishes, and I don't know, I think also being around a table or being with others over food puts us at ease a little bit in some magical way too. Yeah.
So it was interesting seeing a lot of these slides and these concepts. It reminds me a lot of autism and neurodiversity and that idea of disconnection. And, you know, we've also seen a rise of autism too, you know, commonly getting more diagnosed, I think, as time goes on. But my question is, there are some people that really struggle to know how to connect and how to belong. And I also think about that middle layer, you know, kind of shrinking and being, I think, two sides of a coin. You know, people being open to people that are different, that may not have those skills or know how to make those connections. And then I also think about, like, my kids. I have 4 kids. They're all neurodiverse in their own ways. And how, you know, what they go through to even get in a room with other people and the social anxiety that they have. So I guess my question is, maybe on both sides of those coins, you know, how can we help those people enter into community? And I don't know, any encouragement for those who may struggle to know how to connect?
Yeah, that's great. I think at this point, we should all just assume that our communities have people who are neurodivergent, and neurodiversity is just the way in which our community is formed. I think part of it is that we've always been that way, but we haven't recognized it. Now, I think there's more and more agential ability for people who are neurodivergent or families who have a neurodiverse makeup. There's more agential ability for that family to speak up and say something because the language has sort of proliferated a little bit more in our communities. And we know what it means when we talk, generally speaking at least, when we talk about neurodiversity in a context like this. So churches have to just assume that that's the case in the church and to create possibilities for people to engage in ways that fit their neuro style. There's a really, really beautiful book that just came out by a colleague named Sarah Griffin Lund called Blessed Minds. And it's about how churches create contexts that can hold neurodiversity in helpful ways. I just contributed a chapter to a book that's coming out in the spring called Cripping Youth Ministry, which is all about disability youth ministry. And a lot of that book is focused on neurodiversity, neurodivergence. That'll be out, I think, by Erdman's in the spring. Aaron Rafferty is the editor or co-editor of that book. So the literature in ministry studies is proliferating right now around neurodiversity. So there are really great stories to access here too. One of my favorites, Katie Hayes, pastors a church in Fort Worth, Texas called Galileo Church. And their assumption is, you know, that a lot of the church is queer and trans, and a lot of the church is neurodivergent. So everything they do is as inclusive as they can possibly be of queer and trans people and neurodivergent people. So, you know, they have places in the back of the sanctuary where people can kind of walk around and pace. They have sensory libraries where people can come into the sanctuary and get little fidget toys or something like that. I think they even have a space, if I remember correctly, this might have been a different church, where they have like a stationary bicycle that people can be on to move their bodies, because that's a part of neurodivergence for a lot of people, is the need to move one's body and not just to be sort of sitting in a room like that. This is, you know, all for an hour or hour and a half. Lighting is a really important part of that. There's a really great story from a youth minister in a smaller, kind of semi-rural town that I love to tell as well. So this pastor, she's the pastor of this church. And the church had a small youth group, 6 or 8 people. It was the only church in like a 40-mile radius that was affirming of LGBTQ people. So they were sort of known as a safe place for LGBTQ youth to show up. In fact, she said a pastor in a neighboring town called her one day and said, I have a youth who's gay. He's not going to do well in this church. Can I send him to you? And she said, sure. And he sent the youth to that church. But she also started to recognize that many of the youth who were showing up there were also neurodivergent. So she would come in with a whole plan about what to do that evening, and it would be shot immediately because many of them who were, ADHD, their medicines were wearing off, they could not sit and do an activity for an hour or whatever, or they couldn't listen to a Bible study for half an hour. It was something that she had to just sort of flex with as she was recognizing the neurodiversity of her youth. And what they all said is that she was cultivating this place where they would just change the plans at the last minute if it was necessary, because it's who showed up that night that kind of determined what they could do. And people started showing up there because it was the one place in their life that they felt like they belonged. Both queer people and neurodivergent people, and the overlap of those two as well. And the youth started taking an initiative in the church's outreach to the community. So they would have this day once a year where they'd close down the town square, and the church would set up a table and offer refreshments and things like that. And the youth were the ones who went to set that up every year, because they really loved being invitational to others in their community. Some of the youth would ask if they could, very similar to the story with the woman in the backyard, ask if they could celebrate their birthdays in the youth group in the evenings. One of them, this was really amazing, intersecting with some mental health things. One of the parents had been so worried about her child's self-harm that she could not sleep at night because she was worried her child was in the other room and would self-harm overnight. When the child started going to this youth group, she said it was the first time that she could get a full night's sleep because this kid finally had a place where they felt like they belonged. So that kind of ministry is literally life-saving ministry. So check out Sarah Griffin Lund's book, Blessed Minds, this book that's coming out in the spring too, called Cripping Youth Ministry. There's a whole bunch of others. And if anyone wants more resources than that, just email me and I'd be glad to send you some. Yeah.
You started your remarks this evening talking about the section in your book where you're sort of going through all the skills that congregations need to do effective community care. And you mentioned that one of them is knowing when to make a good referral. Mm-hmm. I'm wondering if you might be able to comment on what the kind of the rise of professionalism or the culture of professionalism has done to congregational ministries of care. In my own memory, I can think of times when, growing up, there were just lots of people in the congregation that had a sense that they had within themselves enough to kind of meet the moment, and that kind of care was distributed across the community, and how over time there's sort of just more and more a move towards or a push towards professionalization in lots of different areas of life, but that I feel like I hear more often people saying, well, I could never do that, I haven't been trained, I haven't been prepared, I don't have a degree, I'm not certified. What's your sense of how professionalism has impacted congregational care ministry?
Yeah, that's a really great question. It's impacted in a lot of different ways. I'll just tell you some anecdotal observations firstly. I think for a long time, in pastoral care, in the academic discipline of pastoral care, we were sort of training pastors to be minor therapists in ways that might not have been helpful. there was a whole group of pastoral psychotherapists who grew out of that, who were actual pastoral psychotherapists, but the congregational pastor was not a therapist. And so I think there was often a tendency for people to take on too much in that role. I don't think that's where we are in mainline churches anymore. In fact, more and more I hear pastors and students who, when I'm teaching them very basic care practices of deep listening, being able to be with people amid suffering, asking helpful questions, helping people work toward goals, whatever, they are hesitant to do that because they think that's a therapist's job. And firstly, there aren't enough therapists to go around if you referred everyone who needs a pastoral conversation with you to a therapist. And secondly, those are just skills that I think are part of the pastoral office, being able to companion people through really difficult times. The thing that is even more problematic, though, than the sort of knee-jerk reaction to refer every single thing that comes your way, is the way that we have professionalized skills that are actually just human skills. Like being able to listen to one another without trying to fix each other, being able to look with someone at the pain that they are experiencing in their life without turning away or without trying to shut it down because it's too uncomfortable for us. Being able to help people through hard times in their life, in community, those are just skills we should all have in our communities, everyone, not just the professional minister or the professional psychotherapist. That's sort of where spiritual care first aid comes in. They're the kinds of skills that I think everybody in a congregation can learn and practice. And it's not trying to be a minor therapist. It's just being a good companion with people on the journey of your life together. So yeah, I'm always, rather than trying to help students know where their limits are, I'm trying to help students know what their capacities are to actually companion people in helpful ways in spiritual care practices. Because I think the professionalization has often led us to believe we can do a lot less than we actually can do. And then there are also situations that need referral. The other piece of that, I think, is just the recognition that depending on the geographical location, people are statistically more likely to turn to their pastor before they turn to a therapist. So the pastor can be a good conduit to those who need therapy. But I think people are more likely to turn to the person in the pew beside them first than they are to turn to their pastor sometimes. So I want the person in the pew beside them to have a little bit of skillfulness to do something helpful with that person too. So that's the spiritual care first aid part of it. Yeah, great question.
I want to speak to that as a mental health professional. I think one way to think about it, what you're saying is it's not so different from physical health. I mean, I think there's an important difference between supporting mental health and treating mental illness.
Yeah.
Right? And it's almost like the same with physical health. We can support people's physical well-being. We know how to do that and our own.
Mm-hmm.
And it's not so different with mental health. Whereas I couldn't be available to you when I know you have a physical illness, sit with you, be by your side, encourage you. I can't treat that, right, if I'm not the doctor.
Yeah.
So that's kind of knowing. It's just kind of the same idea if you think of it in terms of medical or a psychological condition. I can pray with you, I can encourage you, but I can't give you that medicine, I can't prescribe.
Yeah.
Or I can't do the surgery, but I can do these other things in the same way with physical health
Mm-hmm.
that I can with mental health, right? So
Yeah, that's really
kind of
helpful.
my thought about how that works. But so many things that you're saying, and an article I think Pastor Amy attached in our connections that you had written sort of addresses how mental health is so supported by so many things we do in the church. You just highlighted the community, the connections,
Yeah.
the caring, the physical presence that are really important for us to think about. If you think about, unfortunately, a scourge right now in our society, mass shootings, school shootings,
Mm-hmm.
what we know, the more research we do on it, is the basis of that is loneliness, isolation, disenfranchisement.
Yeah.
So, important thing to think about for so many
Yeah.
of our ills.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
Thank you. That's really helpful. And part of that picture is I think we have more and more talked about mental health at the point at which the concern becomes a clinical concern that needs the support of a therapist or medical intervention, something like that. When there's a whole lot of space before that clinical concern where we are constantly cultivating mental, spiritual, relational health with one another, or not. I mean, in many cases, we aren't doing that very well. And it's that sort of really wide swath of practices that I want pastors and congregations to be more engaged in, intentionally cultivating. I really think we sort of know what to do when something becomes a clinical concern in most mainline congregations. There are more conserving religious traditions that do have a stigma against mental health care, and that's a different story. That isn't what I see among the ELCA or the PCUSA or the American Baptist churches or whatever. The stigma of reaching out to a therapist is much less than it was 30, 40 years ago in those communities. But what we aren't necessarily doing is looking at that wide swath of practices before the clinical piece to cultivate health within our own communities as much. Or we're not noticing the ways, like all those stories that I told, none of those people were thinking about those practices as practices that supported mental health. But all of those things were practices that supported mental health. And I think part of it is just recognizing the goodness of the things that we do and the value that it holds for people in our communities. Any others that you'd like to talk through?
Cody, I wonder if you have some specific examples of churches that are doing a particularly good job with congregational care around drugs and alcohol and mental health disorders, which of course coexist
Yeah.
to a great extent. I think we can all agree those are still largely stigmatized, especially in good families.
Yeah, I think the best practices, I mean, aside from, the partnerships that develop, I think, in communities to meet mental health crises that arise or, the opioid epidemic and things like that, part of the really good practices of congregations that are destigmatizing the care that needs to take place in those situations are congregations that can talk openly about those things. Where, I think one of the easiest ways to begin destigmatizing a situation like that a family might be really hesitant to bring into conversation, is for people to be able to talk about it from the pulpit or in congregational forums. Like the clergy person who said, after he sort of came out to his congregation as someone in recovery, how that suddenly made it speakable for people in the congregation to start saying, yeah, I struggle with that, or my son struggles with that, or whatever, and building the capacity for a church to hold those things together openly and in conversation. The pain of having to hide something really important like that's happening in your family, a mental health crisis or addiction or whatever, is exacerbated by not being able to just speak to your community members about what's going on in your life because you're afraid of what they'll think about it. So making it speakable, I think, is one thing that a lot of congregations are doing more and more. And then beyond that, I think really good partnerships with others in the community who have a more frontline perspective about what's going on with the addiction crises in the area or whatever, to figure out how to make really good, responsible interventions.
Just want to say thank you so very much, Cody. Thank you so much. I'm sure we want to applaud after all of that. It's such good information and education and learning, and it can go so far as you are educating communities and people to care for one another. And so I just want to say thank you again, and just a real brief blessing on your work, if that's all right. Yeah, I'd love that. And if you guys want to put your hand out a little bit like this to just show your care for Cody. Dear God, we thank you so very much for all that you give us in this life. We thank you for Cody and his wonderful work, for sharing and opening up the conversation about loneliness and isolation, and giving us language to help understand more of how we can care for each other. Bless him in his work, in his play, in his classroom, and all the places that he finds himself sharing this wisdom. Give him health and wellness and sustainability so he can keep doing this wonderful work. In your name, amen. Thank you. Thank you so very much, everyone, for coming. Wanted to ask you, are the slides going to be available for folks afterwards? Is that possible? Yeah? Okay, great. Yeah, we'll make sure that's possible. Thank you. There are refreshments in the gathering area, and thank you so much. All are in person and online. Thank you, thank you. Have a good night.